too much from this one, but we're going to do one anyway, just so we can share more point of views with you guys and just give you a better idea of how you may want to deal with this boss. But for the new people, this is a council boss. There is 3 separate bosses that all have a separate health pool. Now, each time one of these bosses hit the 30% health mark, they'll go absolutely nuts and one of their abilities will become more powerful, or they'll just gain a brand new one. Now, for your raid composition, you want to bring 2 tanks, roughly 1 healer per group, and any DPS makeup whatsoever. Now, as there are 3 bosses, and it is vital to the encounter that you know exactly how all the abilities work, we're going to go through them one by one so you know what you're doing.
So let's kick it off with Dire Dark Whisper. Now, she has an aura that causes the other 2 bosses to become completely immune to damage if they are within 25 yards of her. Because of this, she must be tanked over 25 yards away from the other 2 mobs, otherwise they'll become immune and everyone will be angry at you. Now, on occasion, she'll do something called Nightmare Visage. This will turn her into a shadowy demon and she'll just start wailing on your tank for a short time before returning to her normal state. Just make sure you use some sort of active mitigation, and healers just pay attention to your tank during this time.
Now, the main ability that Dire Dark Whisper has is something called Mark of the Necromancer, and this works very similar to how Rack works from Sinestra and Bastion of Twilight. Now, this Mark of the Necromancer debuff is permanent and just deals ever-increasing damage. However, you can dispel it. However, when you do decide to dispel it, it will jump to 2 players, but it will reset its damage and will start ramping up again. Now, the only way that this debuff is removed from every single player in the raid team is when Dark Whisper casts something called Reap. Not only does this cause the debuff to be completely removed, which is great news, this also causes every single player that is affected by the Mark of the Necromancer debuff to actually spawn a permanent pool of shadowy shit that deals ticking damage to anyone stood inside it. So the idea is that you need to spam heal the people with marks, try and keep it on them for as long as possible while keeping it safe. If you have to dispel them, then you have to dispel them, and then when Reap comes in, anyone that does have the Mark of the Necromancer debuff, which will probably be 4 people, they need to move to the edges of the room, drop the pools in nice neat places, and then just come back to the raid. And every single time Reap does come in, you just need to repeat that exact process.
Another big thing that you need to deal with Dark Whisper is something called Wailing Horror. She causes the whole room to be covered in shadows, which deals light ticking damage to the entire raid. However, during this time, giant ghosts spawn around the edges of the room and pass across the room, dealing large damage to anyone that is hit by them. Now, the best way of dealing with this is having your raid around the edges of the room throughout the encounter, because the ghosts generally pass through the middle of the room, so that way you need to move less, which means you can DPS bosses more.
Now, moving on to Blade Master Jubithos. Now, more often than not, the boss will face a random direction, which is marked with an arrow, and will send out a blade that will just travel so far and then return to him. It will deal damage to anyone that stood in this path, so just make sure you're not stood in front of the arrow. He'll also occasionally start spinning around on the spot, dealing unavoidable damage to the entire raid, but his primary ability is something called Windwalk. What he'll do is he'll split into multiple images of himself around the room, and these images will either send out the blade that comes back, or they'll just spin around and do unavoidable AoE damage to the entire raid. Now, because there is quite a lot of them, it's probably a good idea to use some sort of healing cooldown here, and ultimately DPS kill these images as soon as you possibly can, and any damage done to these images is actually done to the boss as well, which is kind of a nice bonus.
And the last boss that we need to talk about is Gurtog Bloodboil from Black Temple, and he has a lot of mechanics from Black Temple as well, starting with Bloodboil, which will just start dealing some light ticking damage to the 5 players that are furthest away, and this doesn't apply a dot, not on Heroic, it does on Mythic, so you don't need to do any sort of rotations with that. You can pretty much just ignore this ability, it doesn't do enough damage for it to be noticeable. For the tanks to worry about, there's a debuff called Acidic Wound that lasts 30 seconds, and it deals ticking nature damage as well as reduces your armor by 100 per stack. Tank swapping in this fight is a right pain in the ass because of Dark Whisper's immune aura. You need to kind of taunt a shit ton of times when the bosses become immune, and it's generally bad for DPS. However, you can use the next ability to help you out, which is the Fell Rage.
Now, when the boss casts Fell Rage, he will fixate on a target for 25 seconds and just start wailing on them. But one thing to note that this player does have increased defensive stats, as well as has a damage and healing increase. Now, you can bop this target to help reduce the damage, or use the personal cooldown, as each melee hit is actually increasing the boss's attack speed by 10%, making him do quite a lot towards the end of it. Just make sure you keep this player up and you'll be absolutely fine. Might want to assign spot healers just so you have them covered. Now, the way that you use this Fell Rage to help drop the Acidic Wound debuff is by having the fixate target move the boss as far away from the tank right towards the end of the debuff. This means that the boss will have to run towards the tank, hopefully leaving enough time for the debuff to in fact drop.
And the last thing that you have to deal with Mr. Bloodboil is something called Demolishing Leap. This ability is pretty much like Demolition from Black Hand Phase 1. He'll just jump around the room for a while, dealing large damage to the entire raid. However, the further away you are from the boss's jump circles, the less damage you take. So it's really important that you do move from this because it does do a lot of damage, and if you just stand there, you'll probably die.
Now, as we said at the start of the video, each boss, when they drop below 30% health, will actually gain a new ability, or one of their abilities will change in some way that makes them far more powerful and far more deadly. So it's very, very important that you don't drop all the bosses below 30% health all at the same time, otherwise you're going to be overrun. You need to make sure that you kill bosses in certain orders, so it's actually a lot easier for you to do the encounter. First off, you want to make sure that you kill Gertog. His 30% ability is that he'll gain something called Tainted Blood. This is a permanent debuff that he places on the entire raid that reduces their max health by 10%, and this just stacks. Even after Blood Bowl has died, you will still have this debuff. So the idea is, as soon as the boss reaches 30% health, pop Bloodlust, use all your cooldowns, and nuke the boss down before he applies 3 or 4 stacks. If you have higher than that, then potentially the other abilities that come in from the other bosses can be an issue.
Next off, you want to kill Blade Master. His 30% ability is Wicked Strike. This will deal damage to around half the raid, dealing some fire damage. However, this damage ramps up over time, and after he is dead, he will still cast his ability. The Wicked Strike at the beginning isn't too bad. It does hurt a fair amount, but you can kind of start stacking up towards this point, and it is more than healable.
Now, after he's dead, you of course will now have to deal with Dark Whisper. Now, when Dark Whisper goes below 30% health, she won't actually gain a new ability. Instead, she loses one. She will no longer start casting Reap, which means that any Mark of the Necromancers that are active will now stay until the end of the encounter. And on top of that, when she does reach this 30% threshold, she will apply a Marker of the Necromancer debuff on top of half the raid, as well as any that are already active, so you're going to have plenty of those debuffs. Now, out of all the 3 bosses, this is definitely the worst one, because healers at this point are going to have to spend almost every single GCD that they have available to dispelling, because otherwise this debuff is going to ramp up too high and you won't be able to heal it. Do note that with this ability, when you do dispel it, it will just be reapplied to that target, but it does reset the damage. So you want your priests in your raid to be mass dispelling. That will literally just reset 10 people, which is insane. But apart from that, just have your entire raid stacked up underneath the boss, nuke her down, and just spam heals. And that is the encounter.
Yeah, it's not too difficult. It's like kind of avoid basic things. Oh god, ghost coming towards me. Oh god, there's a blade coming towards me. But yeah, it's generally about getting all the bosses to around 50% health, and then nuke off Blood Boil, nuke off Blade Master, then finish off Dark Whisper at the end. And that's, if you can do that, you shouldn't have too many issues.
Well, thank you very much for watching, guys. If this guide did help you out, then please do drop us down a like. Helps us out a lot. And we shall see you in the next video.
Thanks for watching.